Dear colleagues, so we're continuing with our section. Laurie, Manchester, how the Gulag impacted Manchurian Russians, a comparison of forced and voluntary immigrants from Manchuria to the U.S.S.R. Laurie, please, the floor is yours.
I'm going to start my story with 1945, with victory in World War II, when Soviet soldiers liberated Manchuria from the Japanese occupation. In Manchuria at that time, specifically in its capital, Harbin, the largest Russian émigré diaspora in the world existed. With these soldiers coming into Harbin, as you see in this photograph, you see émigrés warmly embracing them.
Laurie, we can't see the presentation.
Okay, so as you see in the photograph to the right, you see émigrés warmly greeting Soviet soldiers. During World War II, many Russian émigrés in Manchuria who had been previously anti-Soviet embraced the Soviet Union. Any distinctions that they had felt between Russia, that of Imperial Russia, which many had fought to protect in the Civil War, and the U.S.S.R., those distinctions evaporated and they collapsed their notions of these two different Russias into one Russia. And thus, they greeted the Soviet soldiers as their Russian brothers. However, within a couple of months after this warm reunion, approximately 10,000 Manchurian Russians were seized by Smersh. Some were executed, most were sent to the Gulag. Most of them were men who had voluntarily or involuntarily worked for the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. All émigré leaders were seized, and those who had worked in anti-communist organizations while they were in China. What then happened was the Sovietization of Manchuria. So all Russian schools, and there were more Russian schools in Manchuria than anywhere in the world, became Soviet schools. The émigré press was disbanded, and contact with the outside world to some extent ceased as Manchuria became a somewhat closed society under Soviet influence. Now, the relatives of those whose husbands, brothers, fathers had been seized in 1945 went to the Soviet consulate, asked what had happened to their loved ones, and were told that they had absolutely no information. Some women remarried, not knowing anything about their husbands. It wasn't until 1952 that those who had survived started to be able to send out notes letting their families know they were alive. Many of the Manchurian men who went to the Gulag survived, and they were released in 1956. Now, despite this massive wave of terror that gripped Manchuria in 1945, in 1954, when Manchurian Russians were given the first opportunity to repatriate to their historic homeland since 1935, when approximately 20,000 had repatriated, and the vast majority of those were executed or arrested. So in 1954, when they were told that they could voluntarily go home, the majority did. Okay, so this is a paradox in terms of this great terror that happened, and then you have 100,000 returning mainly in between 54 and 55. So there's a lot of different reasons for why they repatriated, and you can see a family there leaving at the train station in the photograph. And it's usually a combination of some of these reasons. It's usually not just one reason. So family reunification, right? If you knew that your father or brother or husband was in the Soviet Union, had got out of the Gulag, that was one reason. Also, some families after World War II reconnected with their family members who had stayed in Russia after 1917. Second, it was much easier to repatriate than it was to migrate to capitalist countries, although some did. Third, the Sovietization of Manchuria had led to the youths becoming, for the most part, very pro-Soviet. There was a Komsomol-like organization in Manchuria that most joined. And in many families, once 1954 it was announced that they could return, some young people said, I'll return without you. I will get my passport when I'm 16 and leave. And so that was a reason that some older family members who were more reluctant to repatriated. Fourth, many Manchurian Russians were encouraged by changes they knew that had happened during the war. They had heard about the patriarchate being restored, about churches being opened, and they were especially they're interested in the Soviet officers with their epithets on their uniforms, which reminded them of Tsarist uniforms. Fifth, after Stalin's death, some older people felt like it was safe to go, although we do know that many, not many, but some who repatriated did fear they would be arrested. Also, after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the Chinese definitely wanted them to leave. The Cultural Revolution doesn't start for several more years, but Russians were aware that they were no longer the cultural elite. In 1952, the Chinese language starts being used in higher educational institutions. And so many Russians felt that the only, whereas in Manchuria they lived without knowing any language but Russian, they felt like the only place where they could go, where they could live in an entire Russian-speaking environment was the Soviet Union. So what this paper does is it compares narratives of these forced and unforced repatriates, asking how they define home and how the Gulag affected forced repatriates' notion of home. Now, I should emphasize that these unforced repatriates were not repressed, those who leave in 54, although they did go through intense cultural shock, as often happens with ethnic return migration. The problem was, if we compare ethnic return migration, say, to colonial countries after the decolonization in Africa and Asia, is that the Soviet state never explained to locals why these Russians from China were showing up. And this led to a great deal of confusion and hampered their acculturation into Soviet society. We see a photo of them, a family here. They were sent to state farms in 1954 and 55, and so they had harsh living conditions at first. That didn't help either. So what we see these Harbinsi doing, the voluntary Harbinsi, they engage in chain migration. They tend to leave the state farms for specific cities in the Urals and Siberia. They help each other a great deal and become a diaspora in their historic homeland, of course, completely unofficially in the Soviet period. Now, if we turn to forced repatriates, we see that they also helped each other in the Gulag. At times, they were kept together in the Gulag. Even brigades were made up exclusively, in some cases, of Harbinsi. Now, when they got out of the Gulag, they were inostranci. They were foreigners, and they had been foreigners throughout the time in the Gulag, with the I for foreigner on their uniforms. So when they got out of the Gulag, they were all asked where they wanted to go. Now, some knew that their families had emigrated to capitalist countries or were still in China, and they wanted to go to their families, but they were afraid to do so. They were afraid that it would lead to them being arrested again. Some did say that they wanted to go to Australia or China and were allowed to do so. It was very few. Some were refused going to these countries, but continued throughout the Soviet period to apply to emigrate and were allowed out in the 1970s. But the vast majority of them took Soviet citizenship, and for some of them, they already knew that their families had repatriated in 54 and that they were rejoining them. Here is a picture of a man who survived the Gulag, reunified with his wife. Now, those who were unmarried the unmarried forced repatriates who had been taken when they were young, often ended up marrying Harbinki who had come voluntarily. And through this, they joined the Harbinsi diaspora, which they probably would have joined anyways, since those who were forced repatriates very actively sought any of the friends that they had in Harbin in the Soviet Union. In interviews that I did before that generation passed away, when I interviewed forced repatriates, they would say their closest friends were Harbinsi who had also been incarcerated. The next category would be Harbinsi, and then the last category would be locals. But some unforced repatriates avoided them out of fear and did not want to socialize with them. One wife who had repatriated with her 2 children in 1954, when she went to get her husband from the Gulag in 56, she was so shocked by his physical condition. She herself had been having a very difficult time those 2 years in the Soviet Union that at first she refused to unite with her husband. She refused to take him because he was an invalid and she did not think that he would be able to work. Now, most forced repatriates, not surprisingly, were anti-Soviet. And they have a different relationship in the Soviet period to Harbin and to their émigré past in China. They're able to do this because there were basically, especially in the minds of the forced repatriates, 2 different Harbins. There was the Harbin of pre-revolutionary Russia, which is how they saw pre-1945 Harbin, which of course it was not exactly pre-revolutionary Russia, but that's how they saw it. And then there was Soviet Harbin after 1945. Now, forced repatriates were never in Soviet Harbin. They were taken in 45. And so all of their memories, all of their nostalgia is for this Harbin that existed before 45. Now, that's not the case for those who were voluntary repatriates. For voluntary repatriates, there's one Harbin and it is all mixed together. Now, whereas forced repatriates did not try to become Sovietskие люди, Soviet people, those who repatriated voluntarily, many of them did. They had repatriated, some of them as great patriots because of the war, and they tried to fit into the society, and the Sovietization of Harbin helped them. The wife that I just spoke of, who didn't want to initially take her husband from the Gulag, one of her husband's greatest complaints when he wrote to his friends who were Harbinsi from the Gulag throughout the 1960s and 70s was that his wife didn't even remember Harbin. It was like she'd completely forgotten it. He found the address of her godmother in Australia, and she didn't even want to write to her. So for him, Harbin was sacred, it was nostalgic, and for her, at least in the Soviet period, it was not as important. So home for the forced repatriates is definitely pre-1945 Harbin. For the voluntary repatriates, it's to some extent, for many of them, the Soviet Union. Now, when I say that most forced repatriates did not feel the Soviet Union was their home, it's tricky because there's always this eternal Russia that exists. And so when they visit places like the photograph in St. Petersburg there, or when they go to the Kremlin, they feel that there is the eternal Russia that their families had left before 1917 or during the Civil War. Now, on the other hand, if we look at the genre of Gulag Memoirs and we look at how Harbinsi write about the Gulag versus local Russians who were in the Gulag, local Russians tend to start their story with the Gulag, and their memoirs might only be about the Gulag, might be after the Gulag as well. For Harbinsi memoirs, always half the memoir is about Harbin, The other half is about the Gulag, and that's because they're trying to present an alternative Russian, that Harbin of pre-1945. One forced repatriate from Harbin wrote in 1975, of course, in samizdat, that his views of Russia were superior to those of Solzhenitsyn because Solzhenitsyn had never lived in pre-revolutionary Russia, whereas he, born after 1917, had grown up in Harbin. In 1988, in a letter written to a fellow forced repatriate, one Harbinets who was also a forced repatriate, wrote, "My tragedy is that I still haven't felt that I have returned home." Yet it is in these places of eternal Russia, these pre-revolutionary cities, monuments, churches, that they feel that there are kernels of pre-revolutionary Russia waiting to be awoken. Now, in writing to each other, the forced repatriates in the Soviet period, they call the U.S.S.R. things like this country, the country of our fathers, but they do not refer to it as Russia, and they do not refer to it as home. Now, both types of repatriates wanted to serve Russia, whatever they called it, and its peoples. In interviews, and I've done over 100, and in texts that Forced and Unforced have written, they go on and on about how much they and their fellow repatriates contributed to bettering Russia through their works, right? In interviews, they show me their medals that they were able to achieve. Now, I think it's important to point out that this tradition is based on the fact that in the 1930s in émigré Harbin, they were brought up that their mission was to return to a Bolshevik-free Russia and rebuild it. And for the voluntary repatriates, it was to return to a war-torn Russia, since they no longer thought about the Bolsheviks during World War II. And here, I don't have time to read it, but here is a poem that was written in 1955 by a man who had just been released from the Gulag, in which he talks about his desire to help his people and to be able to be home and to live in Russia. Now, after 1991, however, forced Harbinsi finally feel like they have come home, right? And we see here to the right, scout organizations, which a number of them who had been scout leaders helped to rebuild in post-Soviet Russia. So there's an odd phenomenon going on here, which is that on the one hand, they are very excited that Russia is Russia again, but on the other hand, they want to model post-Soviet Russia on pre-revolutionary Russia, which means pre-1945 Harbin. So their nostalgia, their preoccupation with Harbin continues to exist. At the same time, unforced repatriates, who to some extent had been home in Soviet Russia, no longer feel at home in post-Soviet Russia. For many unforced repatriates, right, their socioeconomic status drops in the 1990s, some lose their jobs, and these are people, many had achieved professional success, had graduated from higher educational institutions, some had joined the party. So for those who felt that the USSR was their home, post-Soviet Russia is not their home. So they're looking for an alternative home, so they look back to Harbin. So for the repatriates, the forced repatriates and the unforced repatriates become united for the first time over this idea that Harbin is home. And again, I don't have time to read them, but these are quotes to the right showing a Harbinka writing in 1988 and then in 1990 to a friend of hers from Harbin. And in the first quote from 1988, when she talks about we, she means we Soviet people. 2 years later, she's talking about we, and she means Harbinsi, and she's opposing Harbinsi to local Soviets. Again, this idea of Harbinsi identity being very much in vogue because the Soviet identity is now disappearing. There is, however, a major issue of contention that exists in the 1990s between forced and unforced repatriates, and that is how they should remember 1945, right? Should they celebrate it as this reunion with their brothers from Russia, or should they celebrate it as this great reunion, or should they mourn it as this time when mass terror came in and their community was torn apart and pre-revolutionary Russia ceased existing? The Repatriate press blossoms in post-Soviet Russia, lots of newsletters, journals, and in letters to the editors, you see letters from forced repatriates saying you're not writing enough about the terror in 1945. Stop writing about how it was a good year for Harbin. It wasn't. And on the other hand, you have unforced repatriates saying, why do you write about the terror? You should write about this wonderful issue, this wonderful reunion, and just about that. Now, some unforced repatriates are under the sway of what I would say is the cult of World War II today in Russia. The only time I was ever asked to turn off my recorder during an interview was when a Harbinka started to talk about how soldiers had been swearing, and that was how she learned swear words. And she thought that that was such an affront to World War II soldiers, so she didn't want it officially recorded. Many Harbinsi feel guilty, unforced, because they sat out the war, and they were made to feel guilty during the Soviet period, and still to this day feel uncomfortable for that. But what is really striking is I have found a few forced repatriates who write that it was only after being in the Gulag did they feel that they had the right to call themselves Russians because they had not suffered during the war. But that's a minority point of view. Now, lastly, my last slide, both groups attribute their survival or success to their upbringing in Harbin. So forced repatriates, when they write about the Gulag, they write that the only way they got through it was because of the morality that had been instilled in them in Harbin, the industriousness, the love of their families, pre-revolutionary values. Now, unforced repatriates, they write about how their success at work was because they did not, like others, local Russians, they did not steal, they worked harder. Again, all of these values instilled in them in Harbin. And I'll just sum these up by quoting a quote from a unforced repatriate in 1994. She was born in Harbin in 1932. And this quote is typical of pretty much any Harbinets. She quote, "My parents preserved the way of life, morals, and attitudes of pre-revolutionary Russia. They inculcated in us such traits as practical-mindedness, steadfastness, decency, responsibility, humanity, industriousness, and lack of coddling." These values are the opposite of what repatriates associate with local or Soviet Russians. Now, by the turn of the century, so this century, and at this point, there were still in 2000 some forced repatriates still alive. When the Repatriate press writes about 1945, they always now write about it as a year of joy and sorrow. As I said, they've managed to unify because they now both feel that Harbin was their home. Now, a division existed in the Soviet period, but the Harbin diaspora still united them within the Soviet Union. They both served Russia or the Soviet Union, depending on what they called it. And that was because of the nationalism that was instilled in them in Harbin, but a nationalism that, as we've seen, can often lead to violence. And the unforced repatriates from Harbin are sort of an extreme example of what people will do to live in one's historic homeland. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Laurie, thank you so much for such an inspiring reflection, for such an inspiring research. Dear colleagues, please go ahead, ask your questions, make your comments. Unfortunately, we're limited in time. We only have 15 minutes for the discussion.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring, very interesting. You know, I don't know whether it's a question in a way. I was very much intrigued by this a kind of diaspora, from the Harbin's diaspora, of course, non-officially, but really existing. You know, in my youth, I met a number of people from so-called American diaspora. So the children of the Americans coming in the 30s, either being communists, you know, idolizing, or just coming to work. And staying, many of them were oppressed, so in a way. And I wonder, I think, is it possible to write a history, in a way, of such non-official diasporas within the Soviet Union, which I think, you know, and comparing their values and their illusions, this historical home, this split in their identity, I think that's it's a very interesting topic. And I'm sure we could create a absolutely different picture of the post-war Soviet society.
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing a book about these repatriates, and precisely my interest, though, in them is that they're coming from the Russian emigration, in that I see them as a perfect way to study the encounter between vestiges of Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. And then in post-Soviet Russia, it's a way of getting at attitudes towards the Soviet past and the pre-revolutionary past, and sort of the tension between the two. So I have in my work, I've been interested, there were very few compared to the mass repatriation was from China, over 100,000. And there were 3 waves from China, so altogether it's like 160,000. From France or from Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, you have a few thousand, but who come right after the war. So in my interviews, you know, I was always asking repatriates, like, did you ever meet anybody who was also a repatriate from these European countries? A few did, and you can also see that in their letters, and I've collected thousands of their letters. And so friendships developed, a couple marriages did develop, both in Central Asia, but generally the Harbinsi within the global diaspora of the Russian diaspora, repatriates from China are separate. And they remain separate in Australia, San Francisco, to this day. And it's an interesting question of why, but one of the reasons is because Harbin was the closest replica of pre-revolutionary Russia, so there was less assimilation. I think it also has something to do with them being in China and being looked down upon to some degree by those who were in the European diaspora and see it as more culturally advanced. But I agree with you completely that I think that an unofficial history of the Soviet Union can be written. And that was why, for me, it was so important to collect as many letters as I could that were written in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And also a way to get the voices of the older generation, because they were the least Sovietized. And so it was, you know, and some of them had lived in pre-revolutionary Russia, right? They had even been adults when they left. And so this encounter, their return, is simply fascinating as to what they recognize, what they accept, and what they do not accept. And so I think it's a way of sort of getting at Russian versus Soviet.
While we're waiting for questions from YouTube.
We have a question. Yeah.
Okay, my wife would say that's very untypical that I'm muted. She is making fun of me, that I'm supposed to listen all morning and cannot speak myself. So I think, Laurie, you're in Arizona, right? I suppose. Yeah. Yes. So we're both here from the American West Coast, so we are shortcut. Very short question, and that question has to do with the previous presentations. Could one say, I'm now focusing on the post-Soviet Union, so post-89, post-90 situation, which was only a small part of your presentation, but of course a point of convergence with the previous lectures. Now, could one say that the way that, so now we would say Putin Russia, but present-day Russia, manages continuity with Russian history, with the past, is by using institutional structures that were created in the Soviet Union and filling them up with certain mythologies, whatever, concepts of eternal Russia. Now, if one could say that. I mean, that is my impression. 2 hours ago, I wouldn't even have been able to think about that. But now with the 3 presentations, I can formulate that hypothesis. That is my first question. Would this formula more or less work? So you use institutions, veterans institutions and so forth, created in the Soviet Union. You leave them, you revive them, but you fill them up with a more neutral, mythological type of eternal Russia. And that is the second question. I mean, it is not, in my knowledge, I mean, very, very scarce knowledge, as if the eternal Russia had not been a mythological horizon activated by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union used that too, no doubt about it. But that is my second and more specific question. Do you have any impression on how the status and the use, the pragmatic use of eternal Russia, whatever exactly that would be, but we all have a concept of that, changed between the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union present-day Russia? Yeah. And thank you for the talk.
Oh, thank you very much. My pleasure. So in the Soviet period, in the post-war period, and very much starting in the 1950s, when there was this move to get as many DPs, as many POWs to repatriate and return to Russia, all of these various institutions were set up for the Sotiechniki. Right, and you had magazines, glossy magazines for Russians abroad called Rodina, and you had Soviet clubs that officially existed in Australia, South America. So those institutions were there, and they presented a rosy picture of the Soviet Union and a bridge to émigrés as a way to keep émigrés or turn some émigrés pro-Soviet, because the Soviet Union always saw émigrés as a threat, even when I think the rest of the world wouldn't have seen them as a threat, but the Soviet Union always did. And it's one of the reasons I think they allowed the massive repatriation, was a way to try to destroy the immigration, and in part it did. But through these institutions, they tried to affect the views of émigrés and to get some to return home. And those institutions existed right through Glasnost and Perestroika, and some simply morphed, maybe changed their name, maybe didn't change their name after 1991. So in 1993, there's a major conference of émigrés in St. Petersburg, where they invite them from all over the world. And of course, this has led to investment in post-Soviet Russia. This has led to, it helps their foreign policy, right? They very much, since the fall of the Soviet Union, they see émigrés abroad as representatives of Russia. So there's all these book series that come out. You may have seen some of them, Russians in China, Russians in Australia. But the weirdest ones is when you have like Russians in India, right? And it's about the first wave of immigration when there were maybe 50 Russians in India, right? And often when you read, and they have them for all these countries, and there are lots of different series. And when you read often they'll have a preface by the foreign minister. And the preface will talk about the important role that these first wave émigrés, who of course were completely anti-Soviet, played in being a bridge between Russia and that particular country. So they're hoping that in countries that have lots of Russians, like say the United States from various waves, that Russians will write letters to their congressmen, their senators, to try to help foreign policy. So there is that continuity. Second question about internal Russia. So the last chapter of my book is about representations of repatriates in post-Soviet Russia. Putin has been very interested in promoting a cult of the first wave, right? So Denikin was reburied in Moscow. Putin went to Putin's grave. But so from the point of view of the Russian state and Russian statesmen, the first wave, as long as the leaders that they are encouraging were pro-Soviet during World War II, so say Wrangel, who had died before World War II, so we don't know what he would have said during World War II, he is not celebrated. But Denikin lived through World War II. He embraced the Soviet Union. So it's a matter of what their politics were. And if it comes to World War II, that's very that's very tricky. But among locals, I just want to say quickly, they're very divided on how they feel about repatriates. And I think this is because Russian national identity right now is so conflicted and so fragile. And so you have some who worship repatriates, see them as the real Russians because they see them as representing pre-revolutionary Russia. Others see them because they were not born in the Soviet Union, they're foreigners. So they're a very tricky subject, I think, and in part because of this connection to eternal Russia. And for some people who grew up in the Soviet Union, they can't reject the Soviet experience from their notion of Russianness.
Thank you.
Laurie, thank you so much. Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. I guess if there are no further comments or questions, we are going to move on to the next presentation. Irina, you wanted to say something?
Do we still have time for one question?
Just 1 minute.
You know, just my ideas about this eternal Russia and the present Putin's politics. You know, interesting enough, if you look at the Soviet period, especially at the Stalinist period, so he very quickly returned to this idea of Russian Empire and imperial history. During the 1920s, it was an attempt to create new ideology and new historical sequences, you know. But in the 30s, Stalin and his clique realized that there is not enough ideological tools and instruments in a way. So he absorbed this imperial period, you know, very specifically in a way, but he adopted this eternal Russia into the Soviet canon. And what we can see now, it's the same thing to some extent. This is a great victory, but still we are inheriting the great history of Russia. And some officials, which is really funny, just to say that if you compare the present day situation with the pre-revolutionary Russia, probably this is the period of Nicholas II. In a way, funnily enough, we all remember how this poor Tsar ended, very tragically, I would say. So it's funny that this image of eternal Russia is still very powerful.
Yeah, and I want to just add really quickly that Harbinsi were very much aware of the changes going on in the 1930s. Ustralov, who Stalin drew upon, Ustralov was a Harbinets who returned in 1935. And I argue in my book that they embrace national Bolshevism, even though the majority don't use the term, but they follow all of this, the resurrection of any of these pre-revolutionary heroes by Stalin. To the point where, and that's part of them feeling the Soviet Union has changed, that it has become Russia again because it's returned to eternal Russia. Mm-hmm. That's before they repatriate.
Laurie, thank you so much. Let's hope there is a continuation of the discussion on the pages of our magazine.